Welcome to Behind the Dark Lens. I'm your host, Olga Medvedev-Young. Joining us today is award-winning filmmaker Julie Mallozzi. Her work has won awards at festivals all around the world and has screened in museums, universities, and public television. She has also taught at numerous universities in Boston. Julie is here today to discuss her third feature documentary, Indelible Lalita. The film examined the life of an Indian woman named Lalita who suffers from numerous health problems, including the loss of skin pigmentation. Lalita perseveres in her day-to-day life as she copes with her changing identity. This is Behind the Dark Lens.
जब भी मैं छोटी थी, 6 बरस की थी, मेरी माँ ने देखा कि सफ़ेद दाग है मेरे पाँव पे। Of course, it was a stigma in India to have any kind of physical defect like that. And she was worried, of course, who was going to marry me. Let's go over the class exercises. The new intern wanted to work late. Within a year and a half of my arrival in Canada, I had become totally white. I was 30, I think, or 31 when I had this ovarian cancer. I felt I had lost my womanhood to a certain extent. You felt that you were sort of just exploding and melting into another identity, and you didn't know what this identity was anywhere. See the fingers?
Julie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about Indelible Lalita. Just can you give us a brief synopsis of the film?
Yeah, it's a portrait of a woman whose body has changed kind of beyond recognition in the course of her life. It's sort of a life story told through her body. And she's a woman who was born in India and migrated from Bombay to Paris to Montreal. And in the course of her life, she lost her skin color. That was one of the changes in her body. So she went from being a sort of darker-skinned Indian-looking person to a white-skinned, sort of Caucasian-appearing, white-appearing person. And she's had many other things, cancers and other things that have affected her body and her identity in many ways.
You hear about Lalita and you want to tell her story. How did you go about creating that?
I was really surprised how open she was when I first just called her up and asked her if she would be willing to meet me and talk about doing a film project. And I thought it was going to be a very small film project, which generally when I start a feature film, I sort of fool myself into thinking it's going to be a little 10-minute or 30-minute thing, and then I get into it and it grows and turns into something bigger.
So one of the health issues that she has is a hysterectomy. Do you think that she struggles to hold on to her femininity?
So the film's about this woman's cultural and ethnic identity, but also her gender identity, her age identity, and her national identity. And I think her identity as a woman was one of the most painful things for her when she had cancer at age 30, and she was not able to have children. She had to have a hysterectomy, and she'd always wanted to have her own kids. And She wasn't even sure she would survive, let alone, be able to have kids. And I think it was a big shock to her. Also, more recently, she's had breast cancer twice and is in the film contemplating a mastectomy. And, sort of the loss of these bodily organs that represent womanhood, along with having lost your outward racial identity, was pretty shocking to her.
The loss of skin pigmentation, how does that affect who she is in terms of her background, in terms of her Indian culture?
What I find interesting is the sort of inside, she kind of plows on through and she integrates things from her life in a very natural way. But outside, of course, how other people see her is completely different. And when she goes back to India now, all the cab drivers try to cheat her because they think she's foreign. And she goes to the market. In the film, she goes to the market and there's a vegetable seller who doesn't think she's Indian. People, don't know how to place her. When she's in Canada, she speaks French very well, pretty much fluently, but she does have an accent, but they don't know from where. So I think, externally people see her and don't know how to place her. But inside she's very strong. And
what were some of the difficulties in making this film?
In some ways, this film was easier to make than any film I've made, and that in the sense of access, she was very open and willing to be filmed. So that was not so hard. Funding is always, everyone will, I think, agree with an independent filmmaking community that this is the hardest thing, is to find funding. Yeah. There's just limited funding. I did have a little bit of funding, but I've had more funding for other works that I've done. And I think, as I said, distribution, I think for this piece is one of the most challenging things, to find a place for a kind of artistic piece that's not so experimental to be an experimental film, but a little bit weird to be a mainstream television film, It's hard because the film has a lot of down moments. She has illness after illness, and I even eliminated 3 or 4 illnesses and tried to keep it so it wasn't too depressing. So, I had to make sure to try to balance that with the light moments so that it wasn't just this downer, because she has this spark, and I wanted to make sure that spark came through.
I definitely think that the spark came through. I think that as a filmmaker, you really did show that side of her. I want to talk a little bit about Lalita's mother and the relationship that they had.
The story with her mom kind of starts, which is where the film opens, with the story of her mother being pregnant with her.
She took a pill.
Yeah, she took a pill to try to cause an abortion, basically, because she had 5 children already, and she didn't really want any more children. And I think her mother felt guilty her whole life for having, it didn't work, obviously, and the twins were born, but it seems somehow possibly that Lalita physically took the brunt of the, it's not really clear whether this is true or not, but there's a feeling out there that perhaps this pill impacted her health. Her brother has been very healthy despite not always taking as good care of his body as he could, and Lalita meanwhile does yoga and goes to the gym and eats very well, vegetarian a lot of the times, and she's had all these health problems. So sometimes, at least metaphorically in the film, there's a question about, did that pill start this chain of events that became a series of illnesses? And I think her mother did feel that guilt all her life.
Does Lalita think that the pill somehow affected her?
Well, that's a good question. We had a lot of conversations about this in the edit room with my editing consultant and my producing consultant. And no, I think Lalita thinks it had nothing to do with it. She thinks she just got all the bad genes from both sides of her family.
Yeah.
And there was some delicate editing that even went into the actual wording of the way she said that. Lalita said that pill had nothing to do with it. And someone had suggested to me, well, leaving the question open is very interesting, whether it did or not, and maybe we should add in that I don't think that the pill had any, to make clear that that's Lalita's opinion and not the film's opinion. So very, very subtle, but who knows? I don't know what I believe even.
Do you think that in the end, all of the maybe feelings that the mother had about Lalita's health and vice versa, do you think that the mother perhaps understood that maybe it wasn't her fault? Was there a resolution there?
The thing with the pill that she took, it plays a big role in the film because it opens the film, but in terms of the life, I think it was not necessarily haunting them the entire life. I think in the end they had a very resolved relationship, and Lalita feels her mother was a good mother, and I think their relationship is very meaningful also in the film because you know that Lalita didn't have children herself and wasn't able to be a mother herself, but kind of honors her own mother so much.
You set out to do, like you said, a small, 10 to 30 minute piece, and it ended up being a huge documentary. What was the process like?
I started out being most interested in this change of outward identity, but once I got there and met her, I realized that, first of all, that had happened in the past. It was like 30 years ago. So filmmaking is more exciting when it's about things that are happening now that you can film. Also, I realized that the loss of skin pigment wasn't really, I don't think she personally felt she had that much at stake, even though it seems so dramatic. But for her, these issues of cancer, like ovarian cancer, breast cancer, and what later happens, open heart surgery, major cardiac problems, those are much more serious. They're life-threatening, issues that really make you think differently about your whole life. So I began to gradually start filming all those things, all her medical appointments, the things that were going on now. And as that got going on, I started feeling this sort of visual potential of that, the kind of metaphorical potential of all these medical images, the scans and the echocardiograms and all the ways her body was being treated up close. So I did a lot of up close filming.
I wanted to ask you about that. Some of those images just seem a little bit almost graphic. And what kind of emotion do you want those images to evoke?
Yeah, I think sometimes, people, they watch it, such as my dad, watching the film, squirming in their seat. People aren't used to seeing the camera literally going inside the character's body. It's an unusual, it's pushing the edge, I guess, of something and getting very close. And her body as a kind of archive of her experiences. It's a kind of record. Like everything that's happened in her life is written onto her body. So I was very interested in going, looking at the ways her body was imprinted with this record of her experiences and inside and out. And I just found it also aesthetically very beautiful, and as an artist kind of approaching it that way.
Yeah. I feel like Lalita's a little bit quirky. Her personality, has all these little quirks and interesting moments. In the very beginning, there's the scene of her shuffling the leaves with her feet, and she does that over and over again. Talk a little bit about that. Is that indicative of a personality?
Yeah, that's why I opened with that scene, because I felt like it kind of captured her personality. It's quirky, kind of can-do, also a little bit compulsive, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
She went back and forth. I didn't even use all the time. She went back and forth, and
she does the same thing with the snow a little bit later.
Yeah, the snow. Yeah, and then with the scraping the tomatoes off her cutting board, which also went on for even longer than I used. And I think there's two kinds of shooting in the film. Really, there's this kind of verite. That's a sort of example of sort of observational verite type footage. And then there's this more expressive footage, some of which was even staged, which is something I've never done before in a film. Things like the henna tattoo. She got the henna tattoo because I set it all up to have her do that, because I wanted the symbolic and artistic, the expressive potential of that. And there were a couple of scenes like that.
I've never seen it done so close up, and I just think that with her cultural background, it just was a beautiful, beautiful touch. In terms of cooking, you said you do like to incorporate a lot of cooking scenes. So she loves to cook, and she's very meticulous at the way she cuts everything and peels everything. So talk about how important that imagery was to the film.
In terms of imagery, I think the medical imagery and the sense of imprinting was more important to me. The cooking, I feel it's a representative of culture, and it's a process. It's fun to film process. And like I said, I'm just drawn. I think all my films have some kind of cooking scenes, but they also have a return to the homeland in some way, and this film has that. But in terms of the types of scenes, I think the various kinds of imprinting was a big symbolic sort of thematic metaphor, visual metaphor, with the passport printing, her friend who's a printmaker, the henna tattoo, the various scans, and all the different ways of imprinting.
That definitely came through. So talk about going back to India and what it was like for Lalita to visit her family, and you obviously went on the trip. What was that like?
Well, it was my first time in India, so I was really excited. We stayed in Mumbai, so I didn't feel like I got to see all of India, but I was very moved by how close her family was. This idea of living all together, like all the adults in an extended family all living in one house, which was, typical for India, not so typical in the West. She actually goes back every year, so for her it wasn't that different. In the film, again, it's a singular experience, but in real life she goes back every year. And although this was a special trip, because with me there she revisited all the schools that she had gone to as a child, and she did things a little differently, I think.
What kind of advice can you give to aspiring filmmakers who want to pursue something like this, a project like Indelible Lalita?
As a filmmaker, I find it much more interesting to do a project that I'm passionate about, rather than having a job where I'm producing things constantly that are not my main interest or something. So I think you have to make the film that you want to make. But I guess in this project I also remembered the importance of keeping your audience in mind. It's a balance, I guess, and it could be that I do this with different projects. Maybe I make some projects that are more accessible and have mainstream potential, and maybe I'll make some projects that are more my passion projects that have a smaller audience and they're more artistic and personal. And so that's one approach. You could also sort of try to compromise. I think everyone takes a different approach, but to be able to follow your passion while also considering the fundability and the audience, I guess.
Well, Julie, one final question. Where is Lalita today? Have you spoken to her? How is she doing?
Well, she's doing great. I mean, she's just taken this huge trip around South Africa, the Philippines, to visit her various family members. And she's teaching, as always. She kind of, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, goes through these illnesses. And, you know, it's hard. She has some major health issues, but she has the spirit that keeps her going. So I really admire her.
Well, we definitely admire her too, and we just want to thank you for sharing her story, and thank you for coming on and sharing the filmmaking process, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for watching. Till next time, I'm your host, Olga Medvedev-Young.